Good afternoon, everybody, and apologies for all of the technical difficulties that we had in the first instance. We're starting a few minutes late, which I hope won't interfere too much with your plans for today. I want to welcome you all to the third webinar on the Youth in the City webinar series. This week, we're going to be focusing on how young people use urban spaces as part of their activism and to sort of take back the streets. This is the first part in kind of two sessions that we'll have on looking at youth activism in the streets. So next week, on the 10th, we're going to be looking at youth movements in East Asia, and particularly in Hong Kong. But for this week, we're very excited to have two presentations from two very disparate contexts. And the first presentation that we have is from Dr. Egwurube from the University of La Rochelle in France. And I'm afraid, Joseph, you'll have to tell me how you actually pronounce your name, as I didn't have an opportunity to ask you before the session. Joseph, his research focuses on female empowerment and student activism, and he has a chapter in the new edited collection about when students protest universities in the global south, which is part of a recent collection that was edited by Sarah Pickard, who'll be joining us just as soon as she can get through Zoom's hurdles. But first of all, Joseph is going to be speaking to us, and he's going to be talking about understanding youth restiveness in contemporary Nigeria and the street protests and dissent as forms of claim making. Welcome, Joseph, and thank you for joining us today.
I hope I have a problem with, I can't see my screen anymore.
You can't see my screen
anymore.
Okay.
Have I been able to share my screen? Do you have my PowerPoint?
We are now looking at, you are viewing Joseph's screen, but we are just looking at a black screen.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. If you would like, you could start and just send me the slides and I will share them. You could send them.
Okay, I'll, let's see if I can partager. Je suis en train de partager.
It's funny, we've had, I think, almost zero technical glitches so far, but we've been saving them all up for week 3, where nobody has been able to get anything to work. I do apologize.
Okay, I'll send you my document right now. Just a minute. Where's my? Alors donc, il faut que je puisse donc répondre. Copie, donc c'est quoi ça? Envoyer, joindre. Joindre. I can't see what's happening. What is happening? Donc, no.
If you stop sharing, so go to the bottom, yeah, that's fine, and then
okay.
just send Avril an email with the PowerPoint, then we can share it from our side.
Let's see if I can try again. Okay, I'm going to oh dear, that's I'm lost. I am lost.
Oh, Joseph, why don't you just start talking? We don't necessarily need any slides. Just tell us about your research.
Okay, I'll send the slides afterwards. So the environment within which the young in Nigeria make their claims is very, very disabling, because Nigeria is a deeply divided country. We have many lines of division. We have ethno-cultural lines of divisions. We have religious divisions. We have generational divisions. We have gender divisions. And we also have political and administrative divisions. So Nigeria is a country, is a federation with 36 states and about 770 local government areas. And so the environment for youth coalition building is very, very difficult. And now, irrespective of the difficult environment, the Nigerian youth have been quite vocal in making claims on the state. And the claims they make are legitimate claims from two perspectives. The first is that we have in Nigeria a national youth policy established in 2009, which promises youth empowerment, which promises to cater for the welfare of the youth. Unfortunately, the Nigerian state has overpromised and underdelivered as far as the youth is concerned, because we have rampant unemployment among the youth. We have poverty among the youth. The population in Nigeria today is about 210 million people. Over 90 million people in Nigeria live with less than $2 per day, and most of them are the young. So we have the failure of successive Nigerian governments to cater for the youth as promised. The second perspective, where I think the youth have legitimate, can make claims legitimately, is that Nigeria is a very young country. Over 60% of Nigerians are below 35 years old. And so the youth, given the fact that they are marginalized, they are despondent, they are neglected. So very often they take to the streets. They use the streets as a participatory device. They use the streets as a parliament to debate and question government output and to aggregate interests. I'm going to use 4 youth protests as an example. I'm going to look at the 1989 anti-SAP protest. SAP was the structural adjustment program that was imposed by the IMF. I'm going to look at the 1993 presidential elections protest. I'm also going to look at the 2012 Occupy Nigeria movement. And last but not the least, I look at the 2020 End SARS protest. SARS is SARS, S-A-R-S stands for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. So it's a police force. I'll try to examine each of these movements on the basis of a number of factors. I'd like to know if they were youth-driven, if they were youth-initiated, or if they were just merely actively youth-supported. I'd also like to see if, I'd like to see their immediate and remote claims, how they were organized, how government responded to them, and their final outcome. For the first, the 1989 anti-SAP street protests, the regime in Nigeria then was a military regime. The head of state was General Babangida. And the youth protested against the imposition of an IMF structural adjustment program, which requested government to reduce its size, to reduce its spending in education, spending in health. And so 33 universities in Nigeria went on strike to demand an end to the IMF program, to demand better accountability, to demand more transparency. The immediate response of the government was repressive. 7 universities were closed down, and the police and the army were sent to the streets to maintain order. There were a number of deaths, I think about 20 or 30 deaths. And what the government did was to establish some palliative responses. It decided, for example, to start a mass transit program to help people travel better. It also accepted to review its minimum salary system. But then in the end, the military continued to remain in power. The IMF program was applied, and it was business as usual. So the claims were not fully satisfied. Second protest was the 1993 protest. It was a protest. The regime then was also military. It was a protest that was organized by a very wide coalition called Campaign for Democracy, that was a federation of about 40 NGOs. And the claim by the young was for the outcome of the presidential elections to be respected, because the military head of state refused to acknowledge the winner of the elections. And so the strike was nationwide from the north to the south, from the east to the west. Many streets were blocked. And of course, the immediate response of government was repressive. So government sent the police and the army to shoot. Many deaths also. But then, irrespective of the police action, the youth and people continued to strike. And so finally, the military president stood down, he resigned. But then rather than declare the elected civilian president as a successor, he set up a caretaker government, which was ousted 3-4 months later by another military coup. So there also we can say the results were mitigated. It was business as usual because the military came back to power. The 2012 Occupy Nigerian street protest, it was not really organized by the youth. It was organized by organized labor, Nigerian Labor Congress. And the youth took part as the infantry troops on the ground. And the objective of the protest was for the government to reinstate subsidy, oil subsidy. And the initial response of government was also repressive. So government sent the police and the army to clean the streets and to maintain law and order. But then there were about 50 people were killed. The 2012 Occupy Nigeria street protest was the first protest where we had the use of the social media. So social media platforms were used to communicate and to mobilize. There also, I can say that the results were mitigated because even though the fuel subsidy was partially reinstated, government repression with many victims. The last protest that I'd like to examine in detail is the recent protest of the End SARS movement. SARS stands for Special Anti-Robbery Squad. It's a special police squad that was set up in 2003 to contain the spate, the very high spate of armed robbery. The SARS protest started when there was a viral video shown indicating that the SARS had killed an unarmed man on the street. And so the video was shared virally, and people assembled in city streets The NSAS movement was important because even though the immediate objective was to end police brutality, the final objective was to struggle for an overhaul of the Nigerian political system, an overhaul of the governing process, more accountability, more transparency. Of course, government with a very Pavlovian instinct unleashed terror. All the states. What was also interesting about the NSAS protest was that it was decentralized. In other words, there was no national leadership, which means that the police could not preemptively arrest people. So each of the 36 states had an action group, and they used, there was an NSAS, a hashtag NSAS, which was used to mobilize, which was used to communicate, which was used to market the protest, which was used to coordinate. The NSAS movement last year was also important because it was the first time that we had women, we had a feminist coalition that joined the fray, that helped crowdfunding, mobilized funds, that helped networking, that also accepted to be on the streets to help those who were injured by the police, to provide water, to provide food to those who were on the streets to protest. The hashtag NSAS was also used to by the youth to control the narrative, to bypass government propaganda. And so, for example, they were able to contact international news agencies like the CNN, Al Jazeera, to show them videos of police brutality in the streets. And so the NSAS movement was also important because you had about 400 young lawyers who accepted to travel from city to city to represent protesters who had been arrested by the police. You also had lots of medical doctors who were prepared to help, prepared to heal and to take care of injured people. So the NSAS movement was important because I think it was a watershed in the way youths organize themselves. It was also a means to internationalize the combat, because the diaspora was contacted, and many people from abroad sent in funds using the Bitcoin. But then, like the preceding protest movement, the NSAS had a very mitigated outcome, because the SARS was abolished, but it was replaced by a SWAT, a Special Weapons and Tactics team. So the SWATs, in terms of policing principles, there was no change in policing principles. So if we look at all the four protest movements, we can see that even though you had some kind of palliative measures from government, the final outcomes were negative. The final outcomes were mitigated. And I think that the reason why the outcomes are mitigated is that the youth and the government are always talking at cross purposes, because what the youth really want is system overhaul, whereas what the government really wants is system maintenance and system continuity. So on the one hand, we have a stimulus from the youth, stimulus which wishes to drive the system towards more distribution, more redistribution, more transparency, more accountability, whereas the response from government has always been regulative, always been law and order maintenance. So I think until we can change the divergence between what the youth want and what the state wants, we will continue to have problems of divorce between the youth and the state. What does the future hold? The future, I think that Before I talk about the future and conclude, I'd like to say that the four youth movements which I've just indicated are movements that try to express dissent peacefully. Now we have some other youth movements in Nigeria which have openly chosen violence as a means of making their claims. One of them, for example, is in the Niger Delta area where oil is exploited. There we have so many youth movements such as the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, the Niger Delta Vigilantes, the Niger Delta Avengers. These have openly questioned the legitimacy of the Nigerian state, and they want compensation for the ecological, economic, and human disasters caused by oil exploration in their communities. Between 2003 and 2009, lots of oil pipelines were destroyed, were bombed. Lots of oil fields were burnt. The youth organized themselves into vigilante groups and engaged in armed combat with soldiers and policemen, until in 2009, the Nigerian state decided to declare an amnesty with them, and then decided to pay them heavily, very, very heavily, billions and billions of dollars for them now to start guarding the installations that they used to burn. So there we can say there's some kind of relative success in claim making using violence. A second example of the use of violence is the IPOB. IPOB stands for Indigenous People of Biafra. And these are people who would like to have an independent Biafran state. And they use violence as a means of expressing themselves. The response by the government has been very, 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 very strict, very severe, very no-nonsense military approach. So there we can say that the use of violence has not really been successful. So to conclude, I'd say that the future Nigeria, youth activism, youth restiveness will continue to remain, because Nigeria will continue to be governed by the old brigade, quote unquote. At the moment, the federal cabinet is a 44-member cabinet. The youngest member of the federal cabinet is 57 years old, 57, the youngest. In a country where 60% are below 35 years old. So we have the youngest, 57 years old. We have 6 ministers who are above 70. So I think the old brigade will continue to retain power in Nigeria. And until the old brigade and the new brigade can see eye to eye, I think youth restiveness, the occupation of streets as a means of dissent, as a means of political expression will continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yosef. And what a wonderful introduction and overview to youth engagement in political activity in Nigeria. I think you also set us up nicely for our second talk, which is by Sarah Pickard and Dena Arya. Sarah had some terrible technical problems, but I believe she is now with us. Hello, Sarah.
Hi. Yes.
Sarah is also trying to come through on her phone, and I guess from a public space based on her mask, as you are currently, are you reporting live from the street, Sarah?
I'm in the youth hostel in a shared room with people in it.
Definitely the most interesting place we've ever had someone dial in from. But thank you so much for making time from your fieldwork to talk with us today. Do you have a PowerPoint presentation that you're going to try and share, or how do you want to proceed? Just as an introduction to the rest of the audience, Dena and Sarah are going to talk about contestation in the city and environmental activists taking to the street, with particular reference to what's going on right now in Glasgow and at COP26. Sarah is a senior lecturer in British politics and society at the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle in Paris. And she has written extensively and co-edited far too many books, far too productive, on politics and protest and young people, including 3 recent volumes on student protest, And then Dena has done a lot of research on environmental politics in the UK, and she is a doctoral student at Nottingham Trent University. Welcome to both of you. Now, have they disappeared? Oh, Sarah, you're there. Yes.
Okay, so hello, thank you very much for organising this. We're delighted to be here. Dena's going to share the PowerPoint, and we're going to take it in turns to speak over the next few minutes. And hello, Joseph. It's nice to see you after editing all your work and hearing about you. It's nice to see you at last in this small, crazy world. Okay. So, hi, Dena.
Hi, sorry, I had some technical issues, but I'm back and able to share our PowerPoint. I'm wondering if everybody can see our screen.
Yes, we can see your screen. Thankfully, our technical issues have been resolved. By the way, just as we're going along, if anyone has any questions or comments, just stick them in the chat and we'll get back to them at the end of the session, okay?
Are you ready
Okay.
to go? We can see this. We can see your slides, Dena. That's okay. So I'll just start. So, hello. Thank you to the Centre for Global Youth at UCL, and especially Trevor Keating, for organising this. And I really enjoyed taking part in the CJY Conversation with series and all the work that went into that. So we're really happy to be here. So if you can just change the slides, please, Dena. Next slide, please. And it's over to you. So
Okay. Well, we're going to talk today about our ongoing research, work with young environmental activists that started about 2 years ago. I'm wondering, Sarah, have I jumped in? Have you already said all of this whilst I was away? No? Okay, great. So looking at our ongoing work with young environmental activists that started about 2 years ago. And yeah, that has led to a number of publications and talks. So first, we're going to explain the importance of youth research and our methods, our main findings so far. I'll give you some of my thoughts on youth activism in the city, and then Sarah's going to contribute by speaking a bit about her concept of do-it-ourselves politics, as well as the issue of policing on youth activism in the city, particularly young environmental activists, with some insights from Glasgow and the COP.
Last, to close our seminar, we'll provide some more reflexive thoughts about what it's like doing research with young activists in the city, in the field. And throughout, we'll be showing our own pictures, our own photographs that we've taken at different locations, just to give you a bit of a feel of it and to give some more realism. And there'll be no faces in the pictures, obviously, to not compromise anybody. And I'm not going to show as many slides as I originally intended, because I've become aware that it's not good to share online at this kind of event, certain things, but you'll understand more later.
Okay, great. Well, just to start us off, tell you a little bit about my doctoral research and Department of Politics at Nottingham Trent University, supervised by Professor Matt Henn. And my research focuses on investigating the role that economic inequality may play in how young people participate in environmental politics in the UK. And I'm doing this using multi-qualitative methods with young people involved in activism, involved in institutional politics, as well as young people who aren't engaged in any political action. And to date, I've carried out 36 interviews, each lasting between an hour and a half to 2 hours, and some happening more than once with young people across England and Scotland, both in large and medium-sized cities. Also carried out ethnographic research with the Youth Climate Strike Group in the Midlands, and that was between February 2020 and January 2021. So many of the participants in my study claimed different political standpoints, determined themselves as either working class or middle class, and came from a range of racialized backgrounds. And key among the commonalities have been their concerns for the environment, firstly, and also the way they see economic inequality as a driver of the crisis. And this was particularly true amongst activists and those who were not engaged in environmental action, who saw capitalism as a core driver of the environmental crisis. And they felt that this really needed to be addressed. And there are a couple of slides here that I have that kind of conceptual that reflect that. So one young person, a youth climate striker from Nottingham, said, "I don't think all capitalism is negative, but maybe it's the natural cause of capitalism to become a monster that destroys everything in its path." My findings highlight that young people involved in varying ways in environmental action experience intersecting inequalities in their participation. So racial and class-based inequalities have come up as a key issue, both with youth engagement in environmental activist groups, as well as, again, those who are not engaged. And having said that, although racial and class-based inequalities are high up on the agenda, other inequalities, of course, also play a part in their experiences. And this includes particularly the challenge young people experience with London-centric activism that excludes and that can exclude groups in the north of the UK. And I want to talk a little bit when thinking about the impact of these inequalities in cities. I want to talk to you a little bit about pandemic activism in cities, and start with a little bit of the ethnographic fieldwork I carried out between January and August of last year with a Youth Strike for Climate group who are part of the wider UKSCN, that's the UK Student Climate Network. And in some respects, the shift to online platforms during the COVID-19 pandemic and the resulting lockdown in the UK, it did actually serve as a partial equalizer between different groups of youth climate strikers. So, for instance, some of those living in rural spaces who'd struggled to attend face-to-face planning meetings or attend protests before the pandemic felt that these new circumstances had actually increased the scope of their online activism and for their participation in decision-making within their youth strike group. And so that led to them attending more and being a greater part of that community. And this certainly created a sense of democratization between the young people who lived inside and outside of the city, and points to wider issues of inclusion for such groups of young people, both in and outside of the pandemic. During my ethnographic research, most of which took place online during the lockdowns of 2020, a key issue that young people from a number of youth strike groups in the north of England particularly raised was the lack of democratic decision-making processes within this national group, the UKSCN. And one example of this was the shaping of the Youth Strike for Climate's agenda around the Green New Deal. The group I carried out research with felt there didn't seem to be opportunities for representative or proportional voting on decisions that were made particularly by those in London. And for the particular group I was researching, this resulted in them not feeling heard, and the group began to distance and disconnect themselves from UKSCN. And it meant a reduction of national support, of a reduction of networks. And my sense is that this played a part in the group disbanding not long after this decision. And the tensions between the London-based youth strike groups and those in the north of England have, at least in my research, seemed to exist beyond the lockdown. Another youth climate striker from Sheffield says regarding UKSCN, we have had little to no support from UKSCN because we are from a deprived area, and I have felt very excluded. Looking a little bit now to the opportunities that lockdown offered young people as their activism shifted from physical sites in cities to online, was that there was a possibility for young people to grow their networks and develop relationships with a wider set of youth activists and learn from each other. One young activist in Leeds said, obviously it's all online and activism is quite hard online, so we're mainly trying to educate other people at the moment. And many young people involved in activism that I researched did end up returning to physical sites of political action, both during and after the lockdown. And we can remember, for example, Kill the Bill or the Black Lives Matter protests last year. And this really resulted from a struggle to feel seen and heard online, particularly as most activism was taking place on private platforms, particularly social media. And so what we've been witnessing very recently, protests and demonstrations are growing amongst youth environmental groups post-lockdown, and particularly amongst Youth Strike for Climate groups ahead of COP, and really curious to see how young people are demonstrating outside the COP26 proceedings and how they experience feeling heard, and look forward to Sarah sharing some of her insights with us shortly. I'm going to wrap up my part by talking to you a little bit about like the inequalities between cities and the London effect, and these experiences of exclusion that young people have been having, particularly those living outside of London. One youth climate striker from Nottingham said, "My personal experiences of alienation are quite foundational to the other things I've been talking about, both in youth strike and feeling like I can't be part of the community because I can't get a bus to London." Now, how young people perceive their involvement and the inequalities that impact their abilities to participate seem to be shaped in part by where they live. And whilst there are issues of inclusion for those living in rural versus urban areas, there are similarly issues of inclusion for those who live in and outside of London. And I'd like to stress that, of course, these experiences of inequality are intersectional and are intertwined with quite complex experiences of gender, racial, and economic inequalities they also face. So one youth climate striker I carried research out with in Sheffield spoke about the cost of getting to London, not being able to afford to go to the COP in Glasgow. And when they spoke about their own socioeconomic status, they said, "I find the term class difficult. I am middle class, but the young people in London are far more affluent than me." And it's quite interesting. So this young person identified as middle class, but then was one of the young people I did research with that actually had to do most of their final GCSE year in lockdown on their phone, didn't have a laptop to do that on. And the sentiments mirrored by this and other young people who felt that they were unable to access events and protests where the big actions were taking place, and felt quite excluded by that. Finally, looking outside of London, one youth climate striker in Glasgow I interviewed spoke about the lack of diversity in youth environmental groups in Glasgow, saying, "This isn't London. Race can be a big inequality, especially in a place like Scotland. It's not the most diverse country." And this reflects how some young people recognized various forms of inequalities that impacted the way in which they could get involved outside of London. And the city of Glasgow is in the midst of the COP26 and is now host to a very international set of delegates behind its doors, and outside hosts a vast number of national and international environmental groups and activists. So I'll jump back in with some final thoughts and reflections in a bit. But now I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to speak about do-it-ourselves politics and the issue of policing of youth activism in the city, particularly young environmental activists, with some insights from Glasgow and COP26. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Dena. That was lovely. That was fantastic. Thanks. So I'm just going to talk briefly about Dio Politics, because I think what Dena's got to say is much more relevant to what we're actually doing at the moment. And so I'm going to go across different screens here. And so as you can see, the idea of do-it-ourselves politics came out of research going back decades about young people. And more I felt that these young people, the young activists, were interested in actually doing politics, either because they thought that politicians were not doing enough, not doing the right thing, or just simply not doing anything at all. And so the idea of the doing came up very frequently in interviews and what they were saying. And so it's about doing politics outside traditional collective structures, doing politics that is personalized, not individualized, that is a word that tends to be used, but more personalized, living it through their lifestyles, everyday politics and identity politics that I think most of us know about already. Doing it collectively, so there's a doing in fluid horizontal movements, and I'll show you some stuff later on. Not necessarily leaderless, and there's some interesting things that we could talk about that, about how the environmental movements are not necessarily leaderless, but definitely doing together as ourselves, us, not the politicians, and doing it together. and outside parties, but definitely trying to influence parties. Next slide, please. And in these next few pictures, these are from Paris in March 2019 for the climate strike then, when young people in the city, this is outside the Luxembourg Gardens, gathered together, brought their cardboard, made their signs together. And so it brought them pleasure and joy and happiness to do it, but also obviously it corresponded to their beliefs, etc. Next slide, please. And then here is in Nottingham, when I did interviews with Dena. And we did lots of interviews about asking, how did you make your placard? How did you choose to do it? What materials did you do it alone? And it provided really great insights into what they were doing and the importance. And we can see that now. I'm in a hostel surrounded by people making and doing things. I can talk about that in a minute, but it's obviously, it's a good entry point to interviews. And it really reveals that politics is not just about putting a cross in a box, although that's important. It's about doing it and living it and enjoying it as well, that it brings pleasure. Next slide, please. And these are some pictures from Trafalgar Square in October 2019 during the International Rebellion. And these sort of things can be seen also at Fridays for Futures events and other climate movements, where there's a sign making place where you can get together with other people and enjoy it. I've talked elsewhere about the importance of Dena as well, and also Ben Bowman, who we work with, about the significance of signs. So I won't go into that too much, but it's, next slide, please. But it all feeds into this idea of do-it-ourselves politics. I'm not going to read all this long quote, but if you want definitions about it or want the book, I'll send it to you. Next slide, please. We have other things to talk about. These are some pictures from, once again, in Trafalgar Square, where the doing is important. The doing of the camping out, the doing of doing the Red Army, the doing of waving the signs, etc. So it's really participating and being in the moment, and it's a way to overcome fear and anxiety by sharing it with other people and feeling that they're having an influence on policymakers and world leaders. Just up the road from me, I don't know if you can hear the helicopters flying around. It's terrible. No, I shouldn't say that. So here are a few quotes. I'm not going to go through all of them. Next slide, please. That talk about some of the things where doing keeps coming up repeatedly in what it, and so that all feeds into this idea of do it ourselves. Just like they don't know what to do, I need you to do something, the government could do something, but they don't, we shouldn't have to do this, we elect people to do this, it's interesting. Will they do something? And then Iris is 12 in Nottingham saying they're not doing enough. Next slide, please. I'm going through quickly, but I think we could talk more about that later. There's a whole series of other quotes that really shows, and they're not prompted. I don't ask them about, I don't deliberately put the word doing into it. It's something that appeared during the interviews. I think, and I also asked them, who would you like to show your placard to? And the last quote on this page says, what are you doing to protect the future of your children and grandchildren, which sums it up quite nicely. Next slide, please. So this just sums up about what I would, so I'll just go briefly, that young people think that the politicians are not doing enough, not only politicians, power holders, corporate leaders, etc. There's a lot, and Dena, I think, agrees with this. We're hearing a lot more about how CEOs of large companies, fossil fuel industries, etc., and the financial sector. There was a XR flash strike yesterday outside JP Morgan here in Glasgow. So it's not only politicians. That's an evolution. I think we both agree that has come about in the more recent actions. That young people initially feel that they can't do anything, and that they lifestyle politics. Oh, can you go back, please, Dena? I'm still on 34. Thanks. That young environmentalists can't do individual politics is not enough, and the interest of doing collective actions, and that the emotions that bring. I think let's move on, because we could talk about that. But I think this idea of doing, and not the same as do it DIY, because DIY is doing it. It could be seen as doing it for yourself or doing it on your own. So it's a kind of shift away from traditional environmentalist and social movements of doing DIY activism. But I like to put the emphasis on ourselves, because I think it's a really shared experience This is a pic I took this morning from somebody making their placard here at the hostel, and there are various others. This is from yesterday in a Extinction Rebellion place that I can't talk about, where they're making their banners, and I wanted to show more, but I decided not to because it's tricky, but we'll come to why it's tricky in a minute when we've got some concluding comments. Next slide, please. Thanks, Dena. Can we go down to the policing? So obviously, I'd like to talk about policing, which is something else that interests me. That's not been written about too much. It's been written about by activists, but much less by academics. It's a tricky, dense thing to investigate because there's a lot of different aspects to it that intertwine. These are just some pics from, oh no, the first one is near UCL, actually. We've seen, I just need to switch to something else, increasing amount of legislation. Next slide, please. That I've written about, so I'm not going to go into much detail with increasing legislation to stop, prevent, and control, repress, securitize, monitor activists, particularly young ones, whether it was the student strikes or now climate strikes and etc. That is increasingly restrictive on them. And the next slide, please. And increasing amount of monitoring, also through filming. I've got pictures of that. I've decided not to show them because I don't want to get into trouble right now. So increasing amount of legislation, but also liaison officers. There are a lot. This is yesterday in Glasgow. Lots of liaison officers walking around that some groups like Netpol find suspicious because they consider them to be part of the police force and therefore part of the problem. Lots of people I've interviewed. Next slide, please. There's a whole, I have to say, here in Glasgow, the police presence is absolutely huge. There's a constant sound of helicopters flying above. There are, this is the view from the hostel I'm staying in yesterday morning. It actually turned around and waved at me, but anyway, never mind. There are huge amounts of police all up the roads, all through the town, helicopters. And to get into the green and blue zone of COP26, there are many barriers, a whole series of barriers, fences, concrete blocks, and huge amounts of police from about 10 minutes outwards. And I have to say the atmosphere isn't very jolly, actually around where COP26 is happening. I've tweeted some pictures of those that I'm not putting up here. It doesn't create, it's not, and people that I've been interviewing have commented, it's not a very joyful environment compared to other COPs, etc., and other places, and other like the Rebellion or the Global Earth Days and things like that. So it's quite oppressive. And what's interesting, next slide, please. And that's really interesting because, especially regarding us and young people in the city, to younger ones, you have to think about what the amount of policing is, but also the tools and the strategies that I've written a lot about that you can look up if you want to, have an effect on young people who want to protest in the city. And whilst younger people might be dissuaded from it, it's quite frightening for them to see so many police, etc., around. Others, it obviously makes them feel more radical and more anti the police, and I say the police in whole, but also police officers as well. And there's also a really, next slide, please. There's a really ambivalent kind of, not ambivalent, that's not a word, a dichotomy of opinions, whereas some people will say individual police officers are just doing their jobs, they have to make a living, they're there to look after us, whereas others are much more anti the policing as a whole, but also, I mean, everybody here is saying that the policing here is absolutely phenomenal, and that money would be better spent in other ways, of course, rather than policing. So should we go forward, Dena? I could carry on. I'd rather answer questions than me just sounding off. I've got.
Okay, Sarah, we've got about 5 minutes left and we can overrun a little bit because we ran late, but I just, if you want to kind of ask for questions or kind of wrap this up shortly, I'm sure there'll be questions.
Can we just give our 2-minute reflections of, because what we've been doing, we've been keeping journals and diaries of what it's like to be an activist, not an activist, whoops, what it's like to be an academic interviewing activists. And I think we'd really like to say it because it's not said enough about what it's like. Over to you, Dena, and then I'll chip in. We'll be brief.
Yeah, of course. Just, I think from my perspective, just to say, there are things to be thinking about doing research at the moment with young activists, particularly in times of COVID, thinking about the precautions and the concerns of how to keep your potential participants safe and yourself safe, things that we didn't really have to think about before, particularly like around wearing masks, doing interviews with young people at protests now with a mask and covering your face means that you're not able to use the full range of your nonverbal communication skills, and it creates quite a barrier, relational barrier between yourself and potential participants. And another thing, I guess, finally to leave with my thoughts on is that, often in my ethnographic research with young people, I'd get involved in strikes, I'd hold banners, I'd march, I'd chant and do all the different elements and get involved. But at an event like COP, and as policing is growing, my question, I suppose, outwardly to everybody is, well, where are our boundaries as researchers? When does research become activism, and how do we know how to navigate that, particularly as we're facing the protests growing in COP26? That's it from me. Over to you, Sarah.
Yes, I think both Dena and I attended an event in Nottingham about academics and activism. I consider myself not to be an activist. I don't take part. I don't wear any signs. I observe. I don't help. I don't advise, even though I'm asked for advice. I don't do it. I think just so a few more points about interviewing young people in the city, because very often the people that we interview tell us what a self-reflexive process it is being interviewed. And so we thought, well, why don't we turn that around and think about it ourselves and keep our journals? So, first of all, I'd like to say that we're interviewing human beings and not just data sets. And whilst mass data sets are great, it doesn't provide the insights, as Dena said, doing interviews for an hour and a half before and during. It's really good to find out what's really going on. But there are a whole lot of hurdles of ethical issues to get over before you even start with universities and ethical consent and et cetera, that I'm sure most of you know that all about. But it's worth doing. But it's also off-putting to the people that we interview because, of course, as Dena just said, wearing masks, but also when you say, are you over 16? This is me, I'm doing this. Can you just read this form first? So do you agree with this? Can you sign this? Can you, it just, but I have to say that most people say yes. You have to be quite clear you're not a journalist and not a police officer either, because there are lots of concerns about people kind of floating around doing that. And also, I've seen quite a lot on social media recently about journalists exploiting young activists, whether they're very prominent or not in photos. But moving on, I think it's often clear, we have to be clear that we don't disapprove of or approve of the answers that they're giving, and that there are no right or wrong answers. I was the only person who ever said no to me to an interview and said that I don't know the right answers to give. I'm proud of not giving the right answers, which I thought was very interesting and a bit concerning also. So also we have to deal with the fact that some of these young people they're all very emotionally involved, and that's why they've made the effort. And that's something that we have to take into consideration, and that they might be tired because they're having very long days. Most of the people that I've been interviewing are completely frazzled, are completely exhausted, and it's only the first 3 days. So, we have to gain trust without befriending them and not breaching that trust and not exploiting them. I think that's really important. And also there's questions like how to react when somebody says they're going to do an illegal act or they plan to do an illegal act. And what do you do with that information? I say that I don't want to know, because the less I know, the better, really. I don't want to compromise them, me, or anything else. But there's also, it's important to know when to stop asking questions, even if you want to carry on, not taking photos. But more generally, I would say, this fieldwork requires an awful lot of technology, techie savvy. No, I don't. Well, yes, especially here. It requires energy, availability, adaptability, flexibility, especially during sustained actions like COP26 over 2 weeks or other things. But planning, but not over planning, because you might be going somewhere and then you find something else going on somewhere else. Oh, there's a helicopter up there. I better move over that way and see what's happening. Oh, look, because things are not released ahead of time. So you have to be bold. I would say you have to be bold. You have to stay safe. You know, have to when to enter a place, but also you know have to when to leave a place. And several times I've left places because I just think I've got 2 children. I don't want to be here anymore. And that's something else I should say. Doing research in the field makes me miss my kids. Over to you, Dena.
Thank you very both. Thank you both very much, and thank you to all the speakers for today. We're actually at 1 minute past 1, and I know we started late. Those of you who don't have pressing engagements to move on to are very welcome to stay while we have a short Q&A. I know some people have already had to leave, so we do fully understand if you have to leave. There are some questions here. Julianne, do you want to unmute yourself and ask and make your comment and ask your question? Oh, you've actually already left. Sorry, I'm very sorry. Julianne wanted to point out that she was struck by the geographical divide and the exclusion, so the role and place in that and shaping, which very much speaks to the purpose of this webinar series, actually calling attention to space and place and how young people are excluded from that. And obviously it's not just on the basis of age, but also on the basis of geography. I wanted to make an observation actually about Sarah's point there about how it's not joyful up there in Glasgow at the protests. And for me, that's a little sad. I went down to look at some of the protests in London. I want to say last year, but it definitely wasn't last year because last year doesn't exist, but probably 2 years ago, and that was the Friday protests. And even the police were having fun. Everyone was just having a laugh and the police were smiling away. There was a lot of them there. It seemed kind of ridiculous given how peaceful and how happy everybody was. But it's sad to think that do you think it's just the number of police or that are shaping the absence of joy?
The fact that Glasgow is very spread out. Actually, actual COP26 is quite far out. You have to walk for about half an hour or pay a fortune to get there. And also, I think a lot of activists are burnt out. You know, they're exhausted, and there's the actual structures of groups have been changing. Fridays for Future people have been getting older, leaving, going on to other things, and so there's a lot of turnover, and there's been a lot of expectations about what's happening. But we're saying this before Friday, Saturday, and Sunday that's coming up. So in Friday, Saturday is when we're going to have big Fridays for Future. There's lots of quite radical events planned by and subgroups of that on Saturday and Sunday. So I think it might clear up. But the weather is lovely here.
Well, good for you. It's bright down here in London, but it's very cold. Joseph, I have a question for you as well about the End SARS movement. So they won a partial victory through their protests in the sense that SARS moved and then they opened up a SWAT team instead. But how do these movements, or do they end? They sort of dribble out a little bit, or has there been a continuity or an effort to kind of mobilize youth in a longer term beyond the specific issue of SARS? I think he's frozen there. No, I'm afraid we may have lost Joseph there.
I can't hear you very well, Avril.
Okay, I think you're having
with the reception.
Yeah, the tech issues are probably back again. I was just wondering about, has there been any continuity or any effort to broaden beyond the End SARS specific issue, and where are youth protests now? Has it generated more? Nope, we've lost them altogether. Well, that's a great shame, but hopefully we will find out more through a different forum. I am conscious that everyone has given up so much time and already to kind of come and listen. Sarah and Dena, I wish you great luck in finding out more. Sarah, I also wish you a long holiday after this, as I feel you might need one to recover what sound like long days.
To add that Dena's work is really doing something that nobody else is doing, rather than just, it's going into the nitty gritty, and she's got a really good angle, and it obviously fits youth in the city, but it's good. And we didn't show our publications, but you can look us up.
That's true. We will add some links, or Dena, feel free to reply to tweets that come out. This recording will go online, so please try to engage in some self-promotion, which I know is hard, but we will do some of the work for you, okay? All right. Good luck, and thank you very much for sharing your research and your reflective thoughts on this with us. Okay?
Thanks so much, Avril.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.